Order of appearance.
Entonces. Yo soy.
Pero tomámoslo en orden de
Puntero izquierdo. No sé si soy. Pero ¿cómo era? Yo hablaría antes.
Sí, primero.
Si tú eres...
No, porque tú hablas global, nacional, yo voy local, así.
Pero tú hablas más sobre grupo. ¿Qué preguntas? Que son más como.
Hello, testing. I'm live. Hi guys. So welcome to the last day of the World Ecology Conference, or at least the last academic day, because some of us are cruising to an island tomorrow. But anyway, so we are going to do a quick start here, just little teeny tiny announcement stuff. After this session, we have a coffee break. Yay, everybody loves coffee. If you need assistance printing a boarding pass or something, gotta happen during that coffee break. If you want us to help you, we're happy to, but it's gotta be at that moment, okay? Sound good? All right. And then after the coffee break, we have a working group session. And then after the working group session, we go to lunch. It's going to be the same procedure as yesterday. After your working group session, please meet on the lobby of the third floor and we'll all walk over to lunch together, okay? Sounds good? And Professor Barry Gills has kindly brought some issues of globalizations and some special issues and whatnot. They're out at the table by registration in the lobby. They are free for you to take and enjoy and get integrated into the globalizations conversation. All right,
Good.
I'm done. And let's get started because we have a really exciting session.
Okay, great. Hello and welcome to the session on global forestry extractivism, current tendencies, local conflicts, and the role of Finnish corporations. And some of you who maybe are not involved in the plantations and forestry debate may wonder why we're having a plenary session on this topic. But I think it's very important, just from my personal experience, not only because I've been involved in these land and plantations and forestry industry issues for a long time, because I think it's very important for the whole world ecology discussion. I mean, whenever I'm trying to explain to my friends some of the ideas connected with world ecology, I always return to the example of pulp plantations, pulp mills, and paper mills. I mean, imagine that I am a worker in a pulp mill. I am actually one of the most productive workers, according to the capitalist sense, one of the most productive workers in capitalism. It's one of the most capital-intensive industries in the world. So when you look at me as a worker and all the amazing value I'm producing, and the paper that we're all using, from a world ecology perspective, you have to look at the things that are alongside me. The machinery that I employ, it's not thousands of dollars, millions of dollars of machinery centered on me as an individual. And not only that, it's not only the reproductive work of my wife and my family and my upbringing that's behind my productivity, but it's also all the work of the land that is feeding the pulp mill, the work of the rivers that are feeding the hydroelectric dams that create the power for the pulp mill. And here again, we're talking a huge scale, unusual scale, even for today's highly mechanized capitalism. We're talking about me as an individual worker taking advantage of the unpaid work in the land and the organisms, not of thousands of hectares, but maybe tens of thousands of hectares centered on me as an individual worker producing value. And of course, when we talk about the history of that land, we're also talking about a lot of unpaid work, the work of the indigenous peoples that lived on it for many generations, creating a fertility that is slurped up by the pulp plantations and so forth. So I think it's a very, very good example when we talk about the dynamics of the world ecology perspective. I think it's also interesting to have this discussion in Finland, because Finland plays also a very important role in another aspect that the world ecology perspective studies very closely, which is the structuring and the mapping and the ideology that goes into creating these cheap natures. And Finland has played a very important role in that, a global role in that, in terms of its forestry expertise, which it's actively exporting to countries, especially in the global south, the machinery as well, the consultancy, education programs. All of these are very important in constructing the images and the ideology and the techniques that are necessary to create these cheap natures that the forestry industry requires for its operations. So I think these are, and this was actually one of the reasons why I have some experience in Finland, because long ago, in about 1990-91, the Finnish activists got together with many activists in Southeast Asia who were experiencing the impacts of the creation of this kind of cheap natures in their countries, which was traceable partly to Finnish forestry expertise. In Thailand, for example, where I worked, there was something called the Forestry Master Plan. This was a big fad in the early 1990s, thought up in a Washington bar by some World Bank consultants. But it was a global program to try to encroach on third world countries, southern countries, in a new way under the ideology of environmentalism. And the Finnish forestry consultants were playing a big part in that. So the Finnish forestry activists here helped to arrange a meeting, or a series of meetings, a series of encounters between the Finnish forestry industry, the Finnish public, and the people in Southeast Asia, especially, who are suffering the impacts of Finnish forestry expertise and Finnish forestry technology. Anyway, that gives some introduction to the importance of the topic. Today we have a very interesting panel. We're going to start with Markus Kröger, who's a associate professor in development studies, Faculty of Social Science at this university. Markus is going to be giving us a bit of an overview about global forestry extraction, and especially the Finnish role, I think, with maybe special reference to Latin America and maybe India. He'll be followed by Teivo Teivainen, who is also with this university, a professor of world politics, who will be talking specifically more about the Uruguay experience with the UPM pulp mill and the reactions to that. Then we'll go to Maria Ehrnström-Fuentes, who has been studying corporate social responsibility, which is one of these terms you hear often if you're an activist, because the corporations are always talking about, well, we have corporate social responsibility programs which will ensure that we are acting responsibly. And if you're an activist, it's very easy to dismiss this as just more bullshit that you have to go through in your struggle. And it is more bullshit, but it's much more complicated than that. It has its own history and political economy, which need to be studied very carefully if they're going to be resisted effectively. And Maria is going to be talking, I guess, not only about that, but about some more general issues as well. And then to wrap up, we have Javier, who is a lecturer in anthropology in Uruguay at the Universidad de la República in Uruguay, and he'll be talking specifically about
the topics of dispossession and resistance.
The topic, thank you. The topic of dispossession and resistance. Okay, so let's get started with Markus. We'll allow 5 minutes each for the speakers, and then give them an opportunity to respond to each other and engage a bit of dialogue, and then open it up to the rest of the audience.
Good morning. So maybe a few words. Thanks, Larry, for those words. So you set it up quite well. So maybe a few facts. So Finland is really an important player in the global forestry extractivism and industry. So about 70% of the world's pulp is flowing through machineries from Finnish companies, and the consultancy companies are almost dominating the sector. Almost all pulp plants are being planned by the Finnish actors. So it makes sense to study the role of Finnish actors, being a Finnish kind of having the responsibility for what is happening all around the world because of this sector. So Finland is, for example, among the biggest landowners of lands outside Europe because of the role of the Finnish corporations. Huge land areas, we're talking about 1.5 million hectares, which is mostly concentrated in places like Uruguay, China, Brazil, but also in different parts of Africa. And we have different kind of actors. We have big corporations like UPM and Stora Enso, which are the world's second and third biggest paper companies. But then we have also other kind of actors, like, for example, the FinFund, the Finnish State Official Development Agency for funding companies, and which has a portfolio, investment portfolio, where about over half of the investments goes to tree plantation expansion in one form or another, especially in Africa. And of course, there are a lot of conflicts around all of these expansions all around. Then we have also, of course, the impact of Swedish, Norwegian, similar actors, but Finland has a much more marked role in this production of pulp. And pulp, if you know, it goes mostly currently to producing tissue and packaging, and the growth of the Chinese market and the e-commerce has really promulgated an expansion in both the kind of eucalyptus-based pulp and then the more other kind of pulp, which you also need in the mix, which is pine-based pulp. So you have currently, with the rise of the bioeconomy, a boom in both the eucalyptus-based pulp plants, especially in the south, and then a boom here in the north, in Finland, on pine-based pulp plants. For example, we have a lot of Chinese investments flowing now into Finland by building huge mega pulp plants here, 1.5 million tons per year, and similar kind of projects as have been happening in the past 10, 15 years in South America. In Finnish peripheries or places that are created as peripheries and resource frontiers. And it's interesting to see how things are changing with this global bioeconomy. So one impact is that the situation is becoming more also like south-north and south-south. So we have, for example, Chilean pulp companies going into Brazil, going into Uruguay, and all that kind of stuff. Then related to the bioeconomy, we also have the rise of what I have called flex trees. So we can use trees in more multiple and flexible ways. And there's a lot of hype around this, like pulp mills in Finland, for example. They are not called even pulp mills, they are called bioproduct mills, or there's a lot of marketing going on that tries to win the hearts of people by saying that we have to go away from the carbon economy, from fossil fuels, and focus on renewable materials. Now, like Larry Lohmann has done a lot of research on this. There's a lot of fiction around this, for example, regarding carbon capture and so on. Maybe some words about this role, the kind of world ecological dimensions of pulping the South. So there are several impacts locally. For example, to the soil, there's acidification, salinization caused by eucalyptus almost everywhere. There's several imbalances that are resulting in water flows, for example, stream flows. And we have examples from all around the world how you have to truck now, for example, water in places in Uruguay, in Brazil, wells are lowering the water balance. And all this goes for the tissue and packaging, so this creation of cheap trees. So it's a kind of an appropriation of the soils and waters of the South for creation of this material, which we cannot eat. Or actually now with the bioeconomy boom and the flexing boom, the new bioproduct mills in Finland, at least technically and theoretically, they could also produce feed, for example, from trees to cows and so on. Or not necessarily cows, but other animals. But then lastly, before I stop my first iteration here, I could say a few words about the resistance and conflicts. When you study these globally, you see that it's not, you don't have the same kind of conflicts everywhere. Somewhere there is more of an absence of conflict. Other places has really violent conflicts. Resistance does not take place similarly everywhere. The strategies really vary, and it depends on what kind of strategy sets people are locally using, that if they achieve the result that they are seeking, such as stopping the expansion of the plantations. So for example, if we take broad comparisons in India in the end of 80s, early 90s, there was a huge pressure to expand tree plantations there, but there the resistance managed to stop this expansion. So there was a huge success in terms of resistance success in India, whereas in South America, Latin America, it continued. In Thailand, the model took more of a form of a smallholder expansion, whereas the corporate owners went to Australia and other places where they could find what the literature calls like pollution havens, and then they were really a result of looking for better tenure security. So what companies are now looking for is tenure security, which translates into the right to pollute that place. For example, we have several stalled impacts also in Latin America, and the place I've most looked in Brazil, and especially southern Bahia, there's currently with Stora Enso's half-owned Veracel, a very severe situation there. Very violent land conflicts, people dying, too many people in the sense of like the company grabbing their land and then not having the possibility to return anymore to the land, and there are like dozens and dozens of different landless movements all around, and the situation is really chaotic and problematic there for the people who are in these camps on the roadsides and waiting for eviction every night or whatever, destruction of their property. And it's very visible there. You can see the eucalyptus and then the makeshift shafts there on the side. But yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating opening statements, and when I was listening to Larry, I was thinking about this pulp factory worker in Uruguay, who, because of the things that you mentioned, is those a couple of hundred lucky ones are making like $3,000 a month, which means the conflictivity, labor conflictivity of these guys is close to zero. Which means that when the Uruguayan president comes to Finland to talk about various things, but it's obvious the main thing is the relationship in the investments in pulp and paper production, pulp production more specifically, that the leader of the Uruguayan trade union is behind there saying UPM is okay. That's very important for the process of legitimizing the pulp investments of Finland there. And Uruguay, for somebody like myself, who's interested in coloniality, in democracy, in sovereignty, is a fascinating case, because you have a government with most of the leftist parties in alliance in that government, and you have the trade union supporting Finnish pulp and paper investments. And that leaves not so much room for opposition as in some other contexts where you have more traditional, let's say, right-wing government in alliance with the capitalist big enterprise, and then the left and the movements and the unions opposing that. And it creates curious things. At the beginning, as we all know, and for example, Jussi Pakkasvirta here, who studied Fray Bentos, the first factory of UPM, known as Botnia then, there were many conflicts related to Argentina. And something that sort of helped UPM in Uruguay was a lot of the criticism was coming from Argentina. So within Uruguay, the environmental movements, for example, criticizing the Finnish investments, were sometimes told, but you are supporting Argentinian position and all that, and that didn't help in the legitimacy of those demands. Now, one question, when they are building a bigger pulp plant now, which happens to be not only the biggest private investment in the history of Uruguay, but also it seems it's only a plan by now, the biggest investment in the history of Finnish forestry. And of that magnitude, related to that magnitude, it's surprising there hasn't been more debate in Finland about that. In Uruguay, there's a lot of debate. And one of the questions to Javier, for example, who's come from Uruguay, and to Maria, who studied on the ground very much the debates and struggles, is like whether you see that now that the new factory is further away from Argentina, is not on the border river, which means that the Argentinian factor is slightly less important. Does it mean that there's more space for example, environmental criticism within Uruguay? The new river is more polluted, it's smaller and all that, so there's this whole debate on environmental impacts. There's talk about compensations, which is a fascinating topic, whether in principle compensations, as some say, they put price tag on nature and that's why they're bad. Others say, okay, if the factory pollutes but then puts the sort of sewage things in order of a city that pollutes, then is that a good trade-off? A new thing that I think is more present than before is the investment protection dimensions of the investment, and where the government of Uruguay has been, let's say, very generous with the Finnish company, for lack of a better, we can specify that term later, and where a lot of people in the opposition, also within the government and in the movements, are saying this is like you bowing too much to this Finnish company, but then again the government says and creates an image of certain desperation in that. But that's a situation not only in Uruguay, that's a situation also in Finland, when we have debates on mining companies, investment protection clauses in transnational like TTIP and other investment the treaties, where sovereignty of a country and democracy, democratic sovereignty, is surrendered to a certain extent, in the sense that the government and the parliament promise that towards the future it will be, if not impossible, at least more difficult to make laws that might go against the interest and profit-making of that company. If that's too much a sacrifice of democracy and sovereignty, if it's done in a sovereign way by the government, is a fascinating question, I think. The time's up.
Okay. Yes. Let's see. Thank you. Yes, so I'll continue maybe from a little different perspective, basically because who I am and what I have been doing. I grew up in Finland with the idea that forestry is good. My granddad was educated in forestry, and he was an educator in forestry. He taught children how to, or young people how to become good forestry workers. I myself had an education in business and have been working in forestry companies for a while in Latin America. And from there, the journey to here is quite long. In kilometers, yes, even longer inside. And I guess it's the reason why I have embarked on that journey are the conflicts that I saw when I was working in 2004, 2005. I was working in forestry companies, Finnish, in South America. And at that time, there were big environmental conflicts in Chile and in Uruguay. So these conflicts created some kind of crack in me that later took me into the interest of looking at CSR as a possible solution. But I also wanted to understand the perspective on the local, from the locals themselves. So I went out to talk to what is called marginalized stakeholders in my literature, or even dangerous and illegitimate stakeholders, and listened carefully to their stories and tried to make sense of those stories in this kind of institutional environment in which we are located. And they didn't really make any sense, but they sounded quite coherent to me in their own little world. And what I want to point out is that when we're talking about locals, we're not talking about environmental movements, we're not talking about ideologies, we're talking about defenders of their own life worlds. And these life worlds, of course, have many different shapes. So some life worlds might be the world of the workers, but there are also endangered ones from this model. And there's quite a lot of those, but we do not see them in the global politics. We do not see these voices do not rise up in the national debates either, because they're translated into environmental concerns or ideologies, or even in Spanish, son locos, because they do not make sense if we're talking about development and progress, because they want to continue to live a life together with the community in balance. So to take it up to that global discussion, that is why they become marginalized. So we have to understand these voices in different ways, and the politics that goes on there in a different way. We have to tackle it in a different kind of way, the politics that are there. And they are important. These are the earth defenders. So these voices must be heard. So about CSR, I still want to talk about that. So now that I look at CSR and these kind of stakeholder dialogues that I've been looking at, they take place in this kind of global politics environment. So these voices have no chance of surviving there. But CSR is more than just communication, and it cannot either be dismissed by those activists that are trying to resist, because it has the power to create dependent relations, clientelism, and they marginalize the voices even further, these intents, and they create strong divisions in these communities. And it's unity that these communities need if they want to defend themselves against pollution in their waters or the arrival of big, large-scale plantations that also take away the water, by the way. So I think that we need to make much more attention to how worlds are made, and also based on my own experience of my own research journey, everybody has the responsibility of thinking of their own limits and what they cannot see from the perspective where they start. And start to, from there, try to also overcome those limits. Because I cannot see the good and bad guys in this, except for a lot of invisibilities. And I think that's what I would like to see more of a discussion on that part.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. This is my first time in a World Ecology conference, so one of the things I learned is about this history of these possessions that we were talking about. And let me just say that one of the things in the Uruguayan case and the relation with UPM and other foreign investments, it's about the dispossession of the imagination for alternatives for the traditional ranching economy. Because historically, these were the main actors, at least in the rural areas, but also connected with the urban areas, because they live in the urban areas and they have, big land holders. They were big land holders. So this arrival, together with the soya bean expansion as well, I think they dispossess us another way of thinking what could be an alternative development model or post-developmentalist model. In terms of resistance, I'm very happy that the workers came to the picture, thanks to some of the questions and the introduction from Larry, because when I saw one of the cartoons that you show us on the first day, I wondered how was a bulldozer that was driven by a capitalist facing a peasant family. But I say, actually, these bulldozers, these big machines, are normally driven by workers, not by the CEO of the company. And I think this is very important in terms of thinking the contradictions for the working class movement. And this is something that happens in Uruguay. For instance, and I will go back to your question about the open space for new criticism. Nowadays, there is, in terms of facing extractivism, there is a huge movement led by the workers, mainly from the public company, the water public company against a new irrigation law, that it would lead to a kind of water market in the rural areas. Yeah? So there is a unification of voices in the working movement, together with scholars at the university and also environmentalists, etc. But when we go to these pulp mills and forestry, as you said, there is a division. Yeah, and the hegemonic view is, okay, we need these new employments, we need these new jobs. And what is interesting, I think, going now straight away to your question of if now that it's far from Argentina and even in time, you know, there is, between the Argentinian-Uruguayan international conflict and current days, there was another environmental or social environmental conflict, which it was the project from Aratiri, which was a kind of Indian company, iron mining, that created an alliance between environmentalists, mainly from urban-based activists, with a kind of new rural multi-class movement, that they succeeded to stop that project somehow, also because the price of iron get down in between. This is a maybe more objective reason, but they came together. And I think now, just in the last days, this kind of alliance came back. So now there is the same environmentalists, the same agents that were against the mining, coming together with a new movement, a multi-class rural movement. Very strange to understand. It's very difficult to understand how they come together, but they come, and they are now against the treatment, against this kind of, you know, treatment that was signed down between UPM and the government. They are not against forestry, they are not against pulp mills in itself, but about the treatment, because the sovereignty theme is more central. So maybe it's just a provisional alliance, but I think we should be careful on how to understand this new movement. To conclude, I think what is going on in Uruguay and maybe in the region, it's something, a new stage of what Alfred Crosby called ecological imperialism, the construction, the building up of the new Europes, he said, yeah, talking about 1,000 years from 900 to the beginning of the 20th century. So this is a new stage. Landscapes are changing, new species are coming, diseases, maybe not for people, but at least for animals and plants and whatever. But I think, on the other hand, this is one side. This is extractivism in its full sense. On the other hand, I would like to evoke, because I heard in this conference that art must be involved in our reflections, I would like to evoke a film by Paul Leduc, Barroco, which is inspired on Alejandro Carpentier's novel, Concierto Barroco, where he shows that along with the violent conquest of Africa and America, it opened up also spaces for more dialogues and hybridity. And I think this is what we also have to take into account and, yeah, to make it better. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for a really stimulating introduction to today's topic. I'd like to go now to the speakers again, just to ask them to comment on each other and to offer additional reflections. And in particular, I'd like to refer to something that Javier and Maria both said. Javier referred to the dispossession of the imagination, and Maria referred to the unheard voices that are structurally kept out of arenas such as corporate social responsibility with their dominance by the dominant environmentalist kind of discourse. And if possible, it would be nice if the speakers, some of you or all of you, could comment on these issues, the unheard voices and the dispossession of the imagination, and not only in places like Uruguay and Chile and Brazil, but also in Finland itself. So why don't we go in the same order that we began with? Maybe start with Markus.
Thank you. So maybe I will start by commenting something on the jobs, labor issue. So there's a big difference between the workers in the tree plantations and those in the mill. And those in the tree plantations are in the worst conditions. So for example, in Uruguay, according to the studies, the tree plantation workers are the worst, in the worst conditions of all worker classes, urban or rural. So that's one thing that we should be worried about with this current expansion. And the same thing is true in Brazil, where for example, in the case of Veracel, a few years ago, there were over 1,500 legal cases against the Veracel company because of breaking Brazilian legal labor laws. Then I have been talking a lot to the ex-workers there who are telling me how, for example, in the 90s and even later, they were hired by the companies to cut down Atlantic rainforest to plant tree plantations, and they were very sad that they had to do this, and then now they are resisting this, and you know, huge areas were grabbed illegally by the companies. For example, in the case of Veracel, there are legal documents showing that at least 50,000 hectares was just taken at gunpoint and destroyed Atlantic rainforest. And it's worth noting that this is not over, but the Atlantic rainforest deforestation has increased dramatically in the past 2-3 years, and especially in southern Bahia. So the companies are still operating there, and the same dynamics are still there of illegal land grabbing. And yeah, maybe just, I would maybe leave it here. I have some other comments later, maybe if there's time.
Yeah. Yeah, this is important what Markus brought up, the unheard voices of those workers who are not the $3,000 per month receiving privileged part, and the union is, as Javier pointed out, divided to some extent with that. About the multi-class rural movement that's emerged, I think in August 24th, they are bringing a petition where there are both environmental movements and rural movements to ask for the government to stop the contract. One of the slogans I saw the new rural movements, where there are also rural business interests there, and all that, they were saying they had this slogan like, okay, because they have difficulties with this sort of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial critique, something, but now that what is good for UPM is good for all Uruguayan companies. So if you give UPM this, like they pay low taxes or nothing, then local companies should get the same thing, which is of course not going to happen. But that's like a new demand that they came up with recently. It would be interesting to hear comments on that. Perhaps on the big landowners and all that, sometimes I hear from people close to the government who say that, yes, exactly, that's as good Marxists. We believe that these new soya production and pulp production, they are good because they break the old oligarchic power of the big landowning classes, and they create new, and it's kind of accelerationist kind of thesis, which corresponds quite well with one reading of sort of Marxist classical literature on India and all that. So that helps to explain also why within a government that has many people who do have a sort of Marxist-influenced ideological background can have such an uncritical attitude towards this kind of process.
Okay, so I'll comment on the unheard voices that I picked up earlier. So what I maybe would like to make clear is that these unheard voices, they aren't them, they are us, actually, and that these voices, with their help, we can, I'd like to pick up on two things, the question that Teivo raised earlier, and also what Javier said earlier about if these diseases are only going to animals or to humans. Well, if we do listen to, for example, these farmers that are displaced and the kind of farming model and the kind of food that they have been providing the people, if we do listen to that and that they are displaced and they are replaced with eucalyptus and soy, then it's not that long for us, if we listen to that, to understand that their story is our story, because we are eating that food that is being displaced. And the second one about, well, so what about this new plant that will be in the rivers, going to a river? Well, again, we have to pay attention to these unheard stories. We have many experiences from pulp mills around the world where fishermen have been telling unheard stories for a long time of what happens. And we can talk about technological innovation, but accidents happen all the time in every place, and these unheard stories are telling us about the risks. But these unheard stories are not welcome as important input in the environmental impact assessment. When we have public hearings, they're not considered within the framework of Forestry Stewardship Council certificates. But these stories still exist, and they tell us something beyond. So that's my point of view.
Well, I'm going first to this. You're very right. Very right. Yeah, I was hegemonized, co-opted by the idea that humans are not affected directly. But yeah, you're right. And the thing is that when you compare what is the package from the soybean expansion comparing with forestry, forestry wins. Because the effects of agrochemicals and the displacement of family farming or the effects on the bodies of people are much more evident in the soya bean agriculture rather than in forestry. It's more evident. It's not. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. So for phenomenological consciousness, it's I think, or maybe it's a way to say, okay, our enemy is soybean and not the other ones. It's just a question. And just to finish, about younger voices, I mean, there is some young academicians, scholars, journalists that you won't see them maybe on the streets, on demonstrations. Actually, there are not many street demonstrations against this trend of forestry, pulp mills, whatever. But it's a lot of movement in internet. So at least there are 3 or 4 new platforms with a lot of information and very, very interesting inputs to think about it. So I think younger voices are on the internet.
Okay, thanks very much. I remember back in 1990, more than a quarter of a century ago, when there was a series of events here in Finland where the Finnish forestry activists invited people from Indonesia and Thailand who were resisting the forestry imperialism in their countries, much of it coming from Finland. There was an interesting incident where one of the Indonesian activists was telling the rest of us and the audience with a kind of astonishment or a kind of wonder about how in Indonesia the workers in the forestry industry there every morning were made to sing a certain song. And the song was about the glories of the forestry industry and how it would bring happiness and prosperity progressively to everyone in Indonesia. And she was starting to sing the song, and then one of the Finnish forestry activists, who was also in the audience, interrupted her. He said, "We know this song already. We know it by heart. We can sing it in our sleep." I'd like to open it up for questions now, but maybe if you would allow me, I'd like to ask the first question of Maria. Maria, you talked about the unheard voices and the unwelcome voices. I was wondering, you lamented that these voices were not being heard. What kind of movement is required, and what kind of movements are already happening that can make those voices be heard, and not only heard, but engage in interaction and in dialogue with other voices?
So what I see from the communities that I've been going back and forward to is, well, the only one that has been really successful in stopping for 20 years a pipeline going into the sea in Chile. Their politics have been very local. It's been about blocking roads and about strengthening their own way of being, making old histories come alive, and ancestral histories, strengthening their indigenous roots. So for them, it seems as it has been a journey inwards. I found actually, surprisingly, something similar in Uruguay, which I wasn't prepared to find there. But I did, and I heard now that I've talked also to Javier that there are actually these kind of broader movements of people trying to get in touch with their Charrúa roots in Uruguay. And in Uruguay, the official saying is that there are no indigenous left here. We are all European. But so this is an important politics that I think is strengthening people from within. And it helps also to bring out alternative ways of thinking about the future, about who they are. And in Chile, again, I'd like to say that this kind of politics, I think somebody said that it was called pocket politics yesterday. But what I've been happy to see now, for example, there was a demonstration about the water, the plurinacionalidad, the agua, in Chile a couple of months ago. And that really showed the strength of this movement as they came out on all streets of Chile, in all places where the water is endangered by different extractive projects. But that doesn't happen if the communities don't go through the first process of looking inwards. But in Chile, this is happening, and every time I see it come out on the street, it is an amazing feeling to see that happening, and I hope that there are other places where these processes are going on. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else from the panel want to comment on that question also? Or should we just open it up? Okay, let's open it up for questions. Let's take a series of maybe three questions. Again, as usual, keep it brief. We have 15 minutes, but let's try to pack as much into it as possible. Yeah, first question from back there. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Jussi Pakkasvirta from University of Helsinki. One basic question that is probably not yet raised there. The question is how the pulp industry itself is organized globally, how the production is organized. Well, you know all very well this discussion, but anyway, we'll ask it. Where is the pulp production and how it's done? We know that there is a growing need for cotton, we need steel, oil, fruits, soybeans, and there is a huge demand on the global markets. Companies answer always like this. And there are not company representatives here, so I take the devil's advocate from capitalist side now. And thinking that, how do you stop the world? Is more ecological, most efficient way of producing huge amount of carbon which is needed here. And forestry itself, I don't like it. For me, it's not like a value question. Is it good or bad? There is forestry, and obviously there are unheard voices, as always, in the very complex processes and as industrial pulp production. And where those voices should be heard then, are they in parliament, government, United Nations, company, corporate social responsibility situation, or here, where we heard these voices, but where those voices are heard then in the other level. And that's like a big issue of the pulp production, any kind of big massive production in the world. Just to open a little bit this aspect that wasn't taken here, because now we are criticizing many processes of the pulp production, but at the same time we know that there is a growing need for that. How do you organize that ecologically in the best way then? We have been discussing with Markus quite so many years of this topic anyway, but let's continue for that.
Okay, let's have a couple more questions. Yeah, right there, yeah. Check.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to complement what you were saying, because I agree with you about the disposition of imaginary and the importance of hearing the unheard and the importance of strengthening communities. However, I also feel that in this pursuit of hearing the unheard, we're also paying too much attention maybe to these communities and the indigenous and the grassroots, and their importance to be strengthened, but it also sounds a bit like growing muscles to fight drones, right? So where is the other part of the story? So we are strengthening them to defend our earth, but why are they in the first place needing to be defended, not to defend themselves? Where is the other part of the story? And this is not to deny the strength and the capacity that grassroots movements have, because I've seen, for example, the case of Bolivia, that they are indeed capable of the unthinkable, but it's also in the pursuit of hearing the unheard and making them visible that maybe we may lay too much responsibility on them and forget the other part of the story. So I was wondering what your comments were on that.
Okay, thank you. And one from the other side of the room over here, yeah?
Thank you for the very inspiring talks. So I have a question to Teivo in particular. It was very interesting what you said about the investment protection. So I was wondering if it is a consistent policy, what could trigger a successful change from within so that to decouple monopolization from protection? Because it seems to me that using protection as an excuse for monopolization is a crucial part of what you said. So if you can comment upon this. Thank you.
Okay, let's stop there and get some responses from our panelists. Who'd like to go first?
Okay, I guess I had two questions there. So first, to Jussi was saying, so the pulp production is global, and it's a fact that it is there. Yes, and it's expanding. It's even green and desirable. Now we have a big plastic ocean out there, and we'll have to deal with it, and we're forbidding plastic, and we will start using paper. That is the message. So, and it's going into the textile industry, replacing cotton. So the pulp is becoming more and more important. It's replacing energy as well. We can start thinking of how it's getting closer to the oil industry in terms of how much is needed for this consumption society. And that is where we have to start. We cannot tackle the forestry issue and what's taking place at the local level in terms of water issues, displacement of livelihoods, if we do not tackle the whole consumer society and the growth issue. So we have to tackle that as well in this. So we cannot take it as a fact that this will go on forever. And luckily there are a lot of people looking at these issues, so that is not where I'm putting my attention right now. But then about just looking at the local level, no, but we have to take this story seriously, and we have to also be able to see the connections and the openings that they make. And I am not trying to say that locals are the answer, but there are valuable lessons that, at least if you're thinking of what deliberative democracy should mean, or what it should mean that we are making informed choices, well, we need to listen. We need to listen much better. We need to use that capacity to listen to also listen inside of us. But it's the locals as a group will never give us the answer, because there are so many different voices. We need to pay attention. Then we need to also consider that. Yes, of course, it does. Yes.
Other comments? Markus?
Yeah, so about the model, well, yeah, it's true, pulp prices have continued to be high, so the commodity super cycle has not come down as for many other commodities, but the commodity paradigm is continuing with pulp. But a lot of this demand is actually created in East Asia, like in China. There was not such a use for tissue paper, for toilet paper. It was created, demand, change in consumption patterns. So we need to, first of all, decrease the consumption all around the world of these products so that we don't have the impacts. But of course, then we can change the forestry model. There's no need to do deforestation as is happening now in Finland, for example, all around the world. Deforestation rising the last 2 years being the highest, the peaks in the Amazon, for example. So in Brazil, you do not need to use agrotoxics. Like nowadays, it's increasing all the time. The use of agrotoxics, it's a mix of pesticides, herbicides, over 15 different types are spread in Brazil, in the eucalyptus plantations, from airplanes, glyphosate, so on, fish dying, all species being hurt by this. So this is a kind of like frontier of existence, as I would call it. That, you know, it's exchanging what can exist and what cannot exist. So the way it is currently done is hyper-extractivist and problematic. So we have to change this, that the fiber doesn't come from plantations, but from forests. And you can do this by different forestry models. And of course the mills have to be very high quality, not polluting, and we need also alternative sources of fiber. They don't have to come all from wood.
Okay, anybody else? Javier, you want to?
Reflection from the national point of view about this question, how to change the forestry model. I mean, what is discussing in local terms is Uruguay shouldn't be only an export of raw materials. So some of the people are thinking, okay, we need high quality, good plantations, because this will be more value added, maybe in different ways to grow the trees. Or some other voices talk about this bioeconomy and say we want to be part of it, biorefineries as well, not only just pulp mills. But let me just, in terms of thinking of new models or new ways of growing trees, there is this dispute, at least a conflict between local governments, because they are the ones who are facing mainly the conflicts, and they are trying to use the land planning law that gives them some autonomy. Yeah, but there is some contradiction with the national government in terms of how to use it. So talking back to resistance, it's not only social movements, environmentalists, these multi-class ruralists, but also there is within the governance, local governments are also a kind of resisting. Yeah, so there are some moratoria for planting in the north, etc.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a couple more questions. We have a little time, starting with you. And again, keep it brief. We only have 5 minutes now.
Thank you very much. I'll try my best. My name is Pablo Sader. I'm the guy in the business suit. I'm the ambassador of Uruguay. I speak of course, on behalf of the country I represent, and also on my own. And many things to say, very little time. So I'll go to the big picture and the basics. First of all, the forestry policies in Uruguay are the fruit of a very long story, 31 years to be precise. We are not being colonized from the outside. We started national strategy, and we had 7 different governments, 3 different political parties, different factions within the parties in power, and it's been a national policy and strategy, and it's been very successful. 30 years ago there was 60,000 hectares planted. Now it's about 1 million hectares, and it's an industry that did not exist, and it changed the face of deep Uruguay for good. There was no expoliation of lands, no deforestation, it's afforestation on the contrary. And I wouldn't say that this is a primarization issue, because there is intensive knowledge involved in the creation of a seedling, and there is, as you said, capital intensive treatment of the raw material. Therefore, I wouldn't qualify this as extractivism. It is, of course, processes of natural resources. And it has also had good consequences in the development of areas of the country that were not developed at all. I mean, Fray Bentos is a case in point. And with the new project, definitely a very empty part of the country would get a much needed, stimulus. I would also like to say that I would to refer very quickly to some of the points that were made, the unheard voices. I believe that nowadays every voice that wants to be heard in Uruguay, it is being heard. I think Javier was making a point about all the movements, social movements that are being created and coordinated. Secondly, the workers' rights and the workers' movement and the mainstream support for these investments from our side. There is one thing that was said is that actually the workers at the plantations are not being, working in terrible conditions whatsoever. It's highly technified, highly mechanized, and the conditions are normal for the industry. And without forestry, probably those people would have been who had migrated to the poverty belts in the cities. I have many more things to say, but I have to stop here. Thank you very much.
Room for maybe one more question. Well, let's go with Tuve.
I have been together with the Finland Forest Campaign since early 90s, so I can give you some information. Also in Finland, we had a situation that the Finnish trade union, paper trade union, was praising the plantations in Indonesia and in Thailand and everywhere, saying that it's good that the companies go outside. And even at that time, the forest companies said that we are not going to continue pulp mills in Finland, but we are going abroad. And these trade union people didn't even believe that the factories are closed down and like that, so they will lose a lot of jobs and like that. So this was a big contradiction. And I also say to Uruguay that be aware, they will move the factories maybe some other place, and then all your forest people will be unemployed.
Okay, well, let's invade our coffee break a little bit to get responses from all of the panelists. If possible, keep your final comment to 1 minute. Let's start in reverse order with Javier.
Yeah, okay, so my main idea is nothing is so simple in this world. Yeah, and although I can feel arguments that say, yeah, well, it's not only extractivism, and there could be a national strategy, or at least the desire of nationalist forces to say we can control this. The reality in Uruguay, I must say, and to contest a little bit my ambassador, is that what it was thought to be the land's priority for plantations, nowadays there are more plantations outside of these priority lands. So there is always ambiguity, yeah, and I think there are some things that we can control, and others really are in this global arena that I came here to learn, and I get many interesting points.
Okay, Maria.
So a final comment on this, and I'm not only talking actually about local voices here, because these voices exist on all different levels of society, but while we have this imaginary going on that, well, we are bringing local development to empty places, and this is not a case about just Uruguay, I see it in my own country even more, then there are voices that are not being heard because they do not fit into that. In Sweden, there is a mine where one of the corporate officials came out and said, "This is it's a mine exploration. This is the perfect location for a mine," because when the investors ask what are the locals saying, I just tell them what local people, and that's going into these empty places. Well, what local people? And he shows just this wood without people, but then the people actually come out. So it is a topic of how are we framing the issue, where are we heading, that what voices will be heard or not.
Teivo.
Well, on the voices, I was a couple of months ago in Paso de los Toros, where this new plant is supposed to be built in Uruguay. And in the meeting, many local people who were somewhere happy about the plant coming, somewhere against, many were confused, and there was lack of information. One of the things I emphasized, and Thomas Wallgren, with whom we went there, was that it's very important, we've been talking about risk and things happen, as you said, and all that, that there would be voices that could connect with voices in Finland, local communities there, if something bad happens, in case this project takes place, or before in the planning and whatever, that it wouldn't be, not be only the company or the state that mediates the voices from there, and that's why building sort of social movement or civil society-based observatory processes has been seen as very important, whether one is for or against or very critical or less critical of the process itself. This is also something with the University of the Republic in Uruguay, I think we will be building to some extent, and let's talk more about the investment protection. There's also lack of information on that, but now there's no time to.
Yeah.
Markus.
Yeah, so I think there will be a big change in the model in the future because of the climate change realities. The current prognosis of tree yield growth are completely unrealistic. We have much more fires, as we are seeing now in Chile, Sweden, all around the world. We will have pests because of this rising. So the current calculations of about fiber are unrealistic. So these are extremely risky and expensive investments at the moment, like they are planning in Finland. There's no material basis of those 1.5 million ton pulp mills in places like Kuopio or even in South America. The fires will be huge. So I think even in very near future we might see a quite big change in this model, because we need to have smaller mills so that we have a smaller perimeter where we need to get the fiber because it's more cost efficient. So yeah, I think the companies will soon start to notice this as well.
Okay, capital never sleeps. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for all of the work they've done and in presenting. And now it's time for a coffee break, but before then, I'm sure that Sophia has something to say to us.
The role of the announcement person, it's a great one. So once again, quick reminder, that if you need anything printed, it's got to be this coffee break, come and see me. The working group schedules are on the registration table, so please pick that up. Our working groups are going to start at 10:40. I know it's a slightly shorter coffee break, but we please ask your cooperation in being timely. And then if you did not sign up for the conference dinner, but you're so engaged with your World-Ecology colleagues and you want to continue that tonight, there are a couple slots open, so come and talk to me, but there is still the cost for the conference dinner. But like I said, if you want to come to that and all, just come and see me, okay? Thanks. Great panel. Yeah, it was lovely. You guys did such a good job.